December 12, 1942. The island of Guadalcanal groaned under the weight of 6 months of unrelenting violence. In the flickering torchlight of a captured field tent, Japanese medics bent over a blood-soaked stretcher. The air was thick with the scent of iodine and rotting foliage, of sweat and cordite that never seemed to dissipate. Supplies were dwindling to nothing, bandages washed and reused, morphine stretched until every drop was gone, scalpels dulled from cutting again and again. Across the jungle, the groans of wounded soldiers swelled like a chorus of agony. Yet as the dawn broke over Henderson Field, a different reality was unfolding. Rows of freshly erected American medical tents gleamed white in the morning light, each brimming with crates stacked higher than a man's shoulders. Nurses in crisp uniforms moved with practiced precision, opening box after box of sterile dressings, sulfur powder, and gleaming surgical instruments. To the eyes of weary Japanese nurses who witnessed these scenes after capture, it was nothing short of unfathomable, a hospital overflowing not with desperation, but with abundance. The clash was not only on the battlefield, but in the shadowed wards where life and death were decided by gauze and glass vials. For the Japanese Medical Corps, every bandage was a treasure, every ampule a sacred drop to be preserved. For the Americans, supply ships delivered medicine by the ton, enough to treat injuries once considered hopeless. The contrast was so stark, it seemed less like a war between armies and more like a contest between centuries. Here, an empire struggling to improvise surgery with sharpened bamboo splints. There, a nation that could flood an island thousands of miles from its shores with hospitals that rivaled the best in New York or Chicago. The first whispers of this imbalance rippled through Japanese ranks not from propaganda, but from the lips of their own captured nurses. They could not reconcile the vision before them. Warehouses of chloroform, plasma stored in glass bottles that shimmered like captured sunlight, entire wings of medical stations designed not for a handful of officers, but for every wounded infantryman. To them, it was a kind of sorcery. How could a nation fight with such excess, where no soldier was abandoned, and every wound was met with a tidal wave of supplies? On December nights, when battles raged across jungle ridges, stretcher teams dragged the broken into the glow of American field hospitals. Here, silence did not reign. There was order, structure, a rhythm like an orchestra of healing. Nurses' shoes tapped against wooden floors. The hiss of sterilizers filled the air. The staccato rhythm of typewriters recorded every name. It was a machine not of war but of preservation, humming as loudly as the B-17s overhead. And yet for Japanese eyes trained on austerity, the abundance was overwhelming. Where they cut bandages from old uniforms, Americans tore open fresh packages of cotton and gauze without hesitation. Where they relied on whispered prayers over fevered bodies, Americans injected penicillin that drained the infection like a miracle. This was not an accident. It was the product of an industrial empire whose factories back home could produce not only tanks and rifles, but mountains of medical equipment. In Ohio, in Pennsylvania, in Illinois, assembly lines ran not just for weapons but for syringes, splints, and blood plasma kits. America had weaponized healing itself. In contrast, the Japanese Medical Corps was bound by scarcity, forced to triage with cruel arithmetic. Which soldier lived? Which soldier was left to fade into the night? It was a decision written not by doctors, but by empty shelves. The nurses on Guadalcanal, when captured and confronted with the sight of American medical supremacy, described it with disbelief. They spoke of walking into wards so large they seemed like palaces, with shelves stacked from floor to ceiling. They remembered the polished gleam of surgical tables, the sterile glass that reflected the glow of lanterns, the endless line of supply crates marked with the insignia of the Red Cross. To them, it was a kind of psychological warfare, proof that the enemy could care for its wounded with a lavishness that defied imagination. Every bottle, every roll of bandage, every vial of morphine was a reminder of the crushing weight of American logistics. But the power of these hospitals was not just in their resources. It was in the morale they built. For an American soldier, wounded flesh did not mean the end. The promise of evacuation, the certainty of treatment, the hope of survival. These were powerful weapons in themselves. Men fought knowing that should steel or shrapnel tear into their bodies, a lifeline awaited them. For Japanese soldiers, the equation was colder. Wounded often meant abandoned, and even survival meant pain without respite. That knowledge seeped into every trench, every foxhole, every whispered prayer before battle. On that December morning, as Japanese eyes scanned the white tent shimmering against the emerald jungle, they saw more than hospitals. They saw a nation that could move mountains across oceans, that could build a sanctuary for its soldiers in the heart of a war zone. It was a vision of strength unlike anything taught in the academies of Tokyo. They had been told the Americans were soft, reliant on machines, untested in the crucible of endurance. But here in the quiet hum of American medical wards was a revelation. The Americans not only fought with steel and fire, but with the certainty that no man would be left to bleed alone in the mud. And so the nurses spoke of their disbelief, their awe, their quiet despair. For them, the war had always been measured in shortages, in sacrifices, in desperate improvisations. For the Americans, it was measured in abundance, in crates, in the unbroken flow of supplies. In that difference lay a hidden battlefield. One fought not with rifles but with bandages, not with artillery but with anesthesia. And in that hidden battlefield, America was winning just as decisively as it was on the ridges of Guadalcanal. The war in the Pacific was filled with clashes of steel and fire, but in the shadows of jungle hospitals, another story was being written, a story of disbelief and awe, of the crushing contrast between scarcity and plenty, a story in which Japanese nurses, trained in the art of sacrifice, stood silent before a miracle of logistics. They could not believe what they saw. Yet what they witnessed would echo far beyond Guadalcanal, a lesson in the hidden weapons of war, supplies, logistics, and the relentless machinery of American industry. By 1942, the war in the Pacific had become a clash of empires not just in jungles and seas, but in the invisible arteries that kept armies alive. The Japanese Empire had swept across Asia with breathtaking speed, from the Philippines to Malaya, striking with ferocity that stunned the world. Their victories seemed unstoppable, built on daring assaults and the warrior spirit of their soldiers. Yet behind those triumphs, their war machine carried a hidden weakness. Logistics stretched thin, supply chains fragile, medicine scarce. Across the ocean, the United States was awakening as a sleeping giant. Its industrial heartland roared like a furnace, pouring forth not only planes, tanks, and rifles, but also the overlooked lifeblood of war, food, fuel, and medicine. For every Zero that danced through Pacific skies, America could field not just another aircraft, but an entire medical corps ready to rescue the men who fell. For every Japanese soldier who bled in silence, there was an American counterpart who knew help would come, not just in bandages but in surgical precision, antibiotics, and transfusions. The Pacific theater magnified these differences. Islands scattered across vast oceans meant every campaign was a logistical nightmare. To sustain a force required convoys of ships, relentless planning, and the ability to project not just firepower, but infrastructure. The Japanese fought with daring, but their strategy leaned on rapid strikes and the hope of quick victories. Hospitals were an afterthought, medical logistics a burden rather than a priority. American strategy, by contrast, was built not only on brute force but on overwhelming sustainment. Marines landing on a hostile beach did so, knowing that within hours, engineers would build airstrips, depots, and yes, fully stocked medical stations. By the middle of 1942, the two visions collided on Guadalcanal. Japanese units were expected to endure hardship, to improvise in the face of scarcity, to find strength in sacrifice. American units, by contrast, were supplied with astonishing thoroughness. Medical supply ships followed invasions closely, offloading thousands of tons of equipment. Field hospitals, plasma banks, sterilizers, even dental chairs. Where Japanese medics boiled instruments over makeshift fires, Americans ran entire sterilization lines powered by portable generators. Where Japanese doctors rationed quinine against malaria, American doctors administered it widely, turning a crippling disease into a manageable obstacle. The doctrine shaped expectations. In Japanese planning, the wounded often became burdens. Soldiers expected to fight until death, with evacuation rare and resources scarce. The Imperial Army glorified sacrifice, and its logistical systems mirrored that philosophy. In American doctrine, the wounded were assets to be preserved. Saving a soldier meant he could fight again, or at the very least his survival preserved morale for those still in the line. It was a subtle but decisive difference, one that reshaped entire campaigns. As 1943 dawned, American hospitals spread like colonies across the Pacific. On New Guinea, tents rose in neat rows connected by wooden walkways. In the Solomons, prefabricated hospitals stood within weeks of landings. Refrigerated storage kept plasma viable. Supply officers counted stockpiles not in handfuls, but in hundreds of tons. Japanese observers, when they saw these marvels, were left staggered. The contrast was not simply a matter of numbers. It was a chasm in philosophy, an empire of scarcity facing a nation of abundance. Even on the home front, the differences deepened. In Japan, cities rationed medical supplies to preserve scant reserves for the front. Civilian hospitals faced shortages so severe that even basic drugs vanished. In America, the Office of War Mobilization directed vast resources to ensure no soldier was left untreated. Entire industries shifted production. Johnson & Johnson produced billions of bandages. Eli Lilly pioneered the mass production of penicillin. General Electric retooled factories to churn out sterilizers and medical lamps. The war was not only fought in foxholes but in factories, where conveyor belts became lifelines for men thousands of miles away. The psychological weight of these differences was profound. American soldiers fought, knowing their nation valued their survival. Letters home reassured families that wounds did not mean abandonment. Japanese soldiers, by contrast, entered battle with the grim understanding that if they fell, their suffering would be endured largely alone, with comrades offering only what scraps they could. Nurses at the front lines embodied this contrast more than anyone. Japanese nurses worked with needles reused until they bent, sutures boiled again and again, antiseptics stretched until they lost potency. American nurses opened new packages daily, their supplies arriving in a stream so constant it seemed endless. The setup for the Pacific War was thus more than a clash of arms. It was a collision between two systems of survival. Japan sought quick wars, decisive victories, and soldiers hardened by sacrifice. America built for endurance, for campaigns that stretched not weeks but years, and it girded itself with warehouses of supplies that dwarfed anything the Axis could imagine. For the Japanese, this imbalance was invisible at first, hidden behind the smoke of victories at Pearl Harbor, Hong Kong, and Singapore. But as campaigns dragged on, as jungles swallowed men and fevers consumed them, the truth became inescapable. By 1943, American abundance was no longer just a rumor. It was seen in the jungle, in the white tents that gleamed like symbols of another world. Japanese nurses whispered their disbelief, recounting the overflowing wards to comrades who could hardly imagine such a thing. In those whispers lay the seeds of despair, for they realized that beyond bullets and bombs, America possessed a weapon far more insidious, the ability to preserve its men, while Japan bled itself dry. The broader context of the war then set the stage for an uneven struggle. Japan, brilliant in the art of rapid conquest, had gambled everything on a war of shock and awe. America, slow to rise but relentless once awakened, had prepared for a war of endurance. And in endurance, the hospital tents and supply depots proved just as decisive as carriers and bombers. What Japanese nurses saw in those American hospitals was not just a medical system. It was a symbol of inevitability, the overwhelming tide of resources that would one day wash over every island, every garrison, every fortress of the empire. The secret advantage was not hidden in the barrels of rifles or the steel plates of tanks, but in something far less glamorous: medical logistics. It was the silent engine behind America's war effort, a force invisible to the enemy until it appeared in shocking abundance. For the Japanese, who expected to fight a war of iron will and scarce rations, the revelation was devastating. They had underestimated the true power of a nation that could project not only firepower across oceans, but also hospitals brimming with medicine. What made the difference was not merely quantity, but quality. The Americans had something the Japanese could scarcely comprehend: blood plasma in bottles, carried by the thousands across the Pacific. A single crate could save dozens of lives, transforming battlefield surgery from a desperate gamble into a calculated procedure. Japanese medics often had nothing but water or rice gruel to keep men alive, forced to pray for resilience rather than rely on transfusions. But in American hospitals, plasma flowed like a second river of life, a miracle delivered by the cold hum of refrigerated storage and the precision of organized supply lines. And then there was penicillin, the wonder drug that redefined medicine in the 1940s. Mass-produced for the first time by American industry, it turned infections that once killed soldiers into minor inconveniences. Japanese doctors watched in disbelief as wounds that should have festered and rotted instead healed clean. Where their own soldiers perished from blood poisoning, Americans returned to the front lines within weeks. To Japanese nurses, it seemed like sorcery. In truth, it was the alchemy of factories in Peoria, Brooklyn, and Boston, working day and night to churn out enough penicillin to flood the Pacific Islands. Even the humble bandage became a weapon of advantage. American nurses opened fresh, sterile packages with every patient. Japanese nurses, bound by scarcity, washed bloody cloths and tied them again to fresh wounds. Every difference carried weight. Sterile gauze reduced infection rates. Sulfur drugs fought bacteria before they could spread. Morphine calmed soldiers enough to survive surgeries that otherwise would have been unbearable. The Americans had built not just a medical corps, but a shield around every soldier, one that extended far beyond the reach of bullets and shells. The psychological effect was enormous. For American troops, the knowledge that salvation awaited them in white tents just beyond the battlefield gave courage. They fought knowing they were not abandoned, that even if steel tore through their flesh, hope remained. For Japanese troops, the knowledge was the opposite. To be wounded often meant a slow decline, perhaps mercy at the hands of a comrade's blade, or abandonment in the underbrush. The contrast between abundance and scarcity gnawed at morale, undermining the very spirit Japan sought to instill in its men. For Japanese nurses, the revelation was even harsher. Their training had taught them to value endurance, to stretch every tool until it was dust, to treat suffering as inevitable. But when they saw Americans discarding used supplies without hesitation, new needles for every injection, fresh scalpels for every surgery, it felt like witnessing another world. The abundance seemed almost reckless, yet it was simply routine. To the Americans, waste was not waste at all. It was insurance against infection, a safeguard born of overwhelming resources. The hidden advantage lay also in the machinery of distribution. America's system of convoy supply ensured that medical equipment arrived with every wave of reinforcements. On beachheads, crates were among the first items unloaded. Hospitals rose as quickly as airstrips, proof that medicine was considered as critical as bullets. Japan, by contrast, relied on fragile, overstretched lines of supply. Submarines and Allied aircraft tore their convoys apart, and what little medicine reached the front was hoarded for officers or vanquished by the jungle's endless hunger. Behind every box of plasma, every ampule of penicillin stood an army of invisible warriors, chemists, nurses, assembly line workers. Japanese intelligence officers, when interrogating captured nurses, could not believe the descriptions of the factories. Entire cities seemed to exist only to support the American wounded. Nurses spoke of rivers of glass bottles, endless rolls of gauze, machines stamping out morphine vials with mechanical rhythm. For Japan, a nation already straining under shortages at home, the sheer scale was incomprehensible. The disbelief of Japanese nurses was not merely shock at quantity, but horror at what it implied. If America could afford such luxury in medicine, what else could it produce in equal abundance? If crates of sulfur powder could fill warehouses, how many tanks and bombers lay behind them? The hospitals were not just places of healing. They were symbols of an industrial juggernaut that dwarfed Japan's war effort, reminders that the enemy's strength extended far beyond the battlefield. The hidden advantage had another edge: time. For the Japanese, every wound drained manpower irretrievably. For the Americans, medical abundance recycled manpower back into the war. A soldier who might have been lost forever could return within weeks, armed and ready once more. Multiply that by thousands, and the balance tilted inexorably. It was not simply about saving lives. It was about sustaining an army, replenishing its strength again and again. Thus, when Japanese nurses whispered of American hospitals overflowing with supplies, it was not exaggeration. It was revelation. The Americans fought a different war, one that measured victory not only in captured ground but in preserved lives. The hidden advantage was not a secret weapon, but an open truth, visible to anyone who stepped inside those white tents. It was the unseen hand that tipped the scales, the quiet force that ensured America's armies did not just fight, but endured. And as the war stretched on, the disbelief hardened into dread. For if America could fight with such medical strength, what hope was there for an empire bleeding itself dry, unable to match even the bandages of its enemy? In the shadow of those overflowing hospitals, the answer was clear. The tide of war was not turning. It had already turned. The story of America's medical supremacy in World War II was not only one of abundance, but of engineering, of steel, glass, chemicals, and the ingenuity of countless men and women on the home front. Behind every plasma bottle that crossed the Pacific, behind every morphine syrette handed to a medic under fire, lay an intricate network of science and industry. To understand the astonishment of Japanese nurses staring at overflowing American hospitals, one must peer into the very machines and minds that made it possible. The lifeblood of the battlefield was plasma. In 1940, American researchers perfected methods to separate and store blood plasma so it could be shipped without spoiling. Plasma did not require matching blood types. It could be given to almost any soldier. Packed in sterile glass bottles, each shipment carried hope across oceans. By 1945, over 13 million units of plasma had been shipped overseas. Japanese medical teams had no such miracle. They relied on whole blood transfusions, impractical on isolated islands, often impossible in the chaos of combat. Where Japanese soldiers faded from shock and blood loss, Americans were pulled back from death's edge by a clear golden fluid. Cold from refrigeration, delivered with precision, then came the sulfur drugs, the chemical guardians of wounded flesh. Crystalline powders packed into tins, sprinkled into open wounds, mixed into water for quick treatment. Their effectiveness was staggering. Infection rates plummeted, amputations dropped, survival soared. Factories in New Jersey and Illinois worked day and night to churn out sulfur by the ton. The Japanese had none incomparable scale. Their doctors often relied on herbal substitutes or diluted antiseptics that lacked potency. To see Americans dusting sulfur over wounds as casually as a cook salting a meal was to witness a technological gulf. Penicillin stood as the crown jewel. Born from Alexander Fleming's discovery in 1928, perfected by American scientists during the war, it became the weapon that even bullets feared. By D-Day in Europe, American factories were producing 650 billion units of penicillin a month. For Pacific campaigns, shipments were constant, crates marked with red lettering. Penicillin, handle with care. It was the drug that turned gangrene into recovery, septic fever into a passing ailment. Japanese forces, cut off from such wonder, watched their soldiers perish from infections that Americans shrugged away with a few injections. Even the tools of surgery bore witness to industrial might. The SCR-625 sterilizer, powered by gasoline burners, could purify instruments in minutes. Portable field autoclaves, shining with steel and brass, ensured that scalpels and clamps emerged as clean as if they had come from a New York hospital. Japanese nurses, boiling knives in dented pots over smoky fires, could not believe the ease with which Americans maintained sterility. Every sterile blade meant another life saved. Every reused dulled edge meant another death. Morphine, too, became a symbol of disparity. The United States produced it in quantities unimaginable, millions of syrettes, each a small sealed tube with a needle attached. Medics carried them in cloth rolls, ready to plunge relief into shattered bodies. Pain no longer broke men entirely. It was dulled, allowing surgeons to work swiftly, allowing hope to survive even in agony. Japanese nurses, with only sporadic supplies of opiates, often turned to primitive measures: cloth for soldiers to bite, sake when available, whispered prayers when nothing else remained. Behind all this was not luck, but organization. Companies like Eli Lilly, Merck, and Pfizer became titans of wartime production, their laboratories racing to meet demand. The Committee on Medical Research, backed by Washington, ensured that innovation was not only encouraged but demanded. Every discovery, whether a new way to dry plasma or a faster method of fermenting penicillin, was scaled up immediately. Japanese medical production, fractured and under-resourced, could never keep pace. Factories destroyed by bombing, raw materials strangled by Allied blockades, scientific infrastructure stretched thin. Japan's doctors and nurses fought not only enemies but despair. Even refrigeration, mundane in America, was a marvel in war. The U.S. Army shipped portable refrigerators to every front, humming machines that kept plasma viable in the sweltering jungles. Japanese nurses struggling with tropical heat could only watch as their own supplies spoiled within days. To them, the American machines seemed like lifelines stolen from the future. To American logisticians, they were simply one more tool in a vast arsenal. The scale of production defied comprehension. One American plant could produce more bandages in a week than the Japanese Empire could muster in a year. Johnson & Johnson alone supplied over 2 billion individual dressings during the war. The Japanese, forced to cut strips from old uniforms, felt the chasm in every operation. Even sutures told the story. Americans used sterile catgut packed in glass tubes. Japanese surgeons often boiled reused silk threads, praying they would not fray mid-surgery. The numbers were not abstract. They were life and death. For every 100 wounded Americans evacuated from a battlefield, nearly 70 survived to fight another day. For the Japanese, the number was often less than half. That difference was not merely statistics. It was fathers returning home, brothers writing letters, comrades rejoining the line. It was the power of engineering harnessed not only to kill, but to preserve. And when Japanese nurses walked through American hospitals, they saw this technical symphony in action. The hiss of sterilizers, the clink of clean instruments, the gleam of glass bottles lined in perfect rows. They touched bandages softer than anything they had known, saw syringes gleaming with sterile promise. To them, it was overwhelming. To Americans, it was simply Tuesday. In war, steel and fire drew the headlines. But in the shadows, the quiet hum of medical machines, the sterile scent of alcohol, the precision of scientific instruments spoke louder than artillery. They revealed a hidden truth. Victory was not just about who fired the most bullets, but who could keep their men alive long enough to fire again. And in that battle, America's engineers and scientists had given their soldiers a weapon Japan could never match. September 19th, 1944. The French countryside near the town of Nancy lay draped in mist, its fields scarred with tank tracks and craters. The Battle of Aracourt was underway, one of the fiercest armored clashes of the Western Front. German Panthers stalked the fog, their cannons thundering, their crews confident in the superiority of their machines. Yet inside the American lines, another struggle was unfolding, not with steel but with blood and bandages. For every shell that tore into a Sherman, for every burst of shrapnel that shredded infantry, the hidden war of medicine surged to life in field hospitals hastily erected behind the lines. Ambulances roared across muddy roads, their Red Cross markings barely visible beneath layers of dirt and soot. Inside, wounded men clutched their bandaged limbs, morphine syringes dangling from their jackets. They arrived not to chaos but to order, a world designed for triage, for speed, for survival. Stretchers slid into neat rows, nurses shouted orders with clipped efficiency, surgeons bent beneath the harsh glow of portable lamps. Plasma bottles hung like glass jewels, their golden liquid dripping into veins that moments earlier were collapsing from shock. The battlefield had moved with them, but here in these canvas wards death was forced to wait. The Germans pressing their assault had no such sanctuary. Reports from captured prisoners spoke of field medics carrying nothing but a few dressings, of soldiers bleeding to death while comrades whispered prayers. Their tanks advanced with menace, but their wounded fell into silence. American soldiers, by contrast, fought with a different confidence. They knew that if fire consumed their tank, if shrapnel tore their side, the odds of survival remained. A chain of care stretched from battlefield to operating tent to rear-line hospital, all fueled by a river of supplies that seemed endless. At Aracourt, over 2,000 American wounded passed through makeshift hospitals in just days. The numbers were staggering, yet the system held. Plasma kept hearts beating long enough for scalpels to work. Sulfur powder turned gaping wounds into survivable injuries. Nurses moved with tireless rhythm, their hands steady even as artillery shook the earth outside. The enemy's shells could not disrupt the machinery of medicine. The war of healing continued unbroken. German after-action reports later revealed bewilderment. They noted how quickly American units recovered, how men returned to the line within weeks of grievous wounds. It seemed impossible. A tank commander struck by shrapnel might be expected to vanish forever. Yet weeks later, intelligence reported him back in action. It was as though the Americans had discovered a way to recycle their soldiers, to cheat the natural toll of battle. The truth lay in the abundance of medical supplies that filled every crate, every tent, every operating table. Even the smallest details carried weight. At Arakour, each soldier received fresh dressings daily, a routine unheard of in most armies. Sutures were sterile, surgical gloves discarded after every operation, morphine delivered in precise dosages. To German medics struggling with shortages, such practices sounded like fantasy. They reused gloves until they tore, needles until they bent, sutures until they snapped. For the Americans, everything was disposable, because everything was replaceable thanks to the endless flow of supplies from the homeland. The battle raged on. German Panthers prowled, their engines growling through the fog. But behind the American lines, another battle was being won silently. The wounded lived. Men who should have died on the field returned to fight again, bolstering morale, preserving units, denying the enemy the satisfaction of attrition. The psychological impact was immense. American soldiers could look into the storm of battle, knowing that their nation stood ready to catch them should they fall. Japanese nurses, when told of such battles, shook their heads in disbelief. They remembered their own experiences in the Pacific, hospitals where bandages ran out within days, where morphine was so scarce it was reserved for officers, where infections devoured men alive. The contrast was unbearable. To hear that at Arakour thousands had been treated not with scraps, but with abundance, sounded like a tale from another age. Yet it was truth. Arakour was not unique. At Anzio, at Peleliu, at Leyte Gulf, the same pattern unfolded. American hospitals absorbed the wounded in staggering numbers, yet remained stocked, efficient, effective. Ships offshore carried floating hospitals, entire decks converted to surgical wards with gleaming instruments and humming sterilizers. Evacuation chains spanned thousands of miles, with wounded soldiers flown to England, to Hawaii, to San Francisco, all while receiving continuous care. The Germans and Japanese alike recorded their astonishment in intelligence briefs. They could not fathom how America sustained such capacity. They had calculated attrition as their ally, expecting America to tire of bloodshed. Instead, the Americans turned wounds into recoveries, sustaining divisions that by all logic should have collapsed. The secret weapon was not a tank or a plane. It was the hospital overflowing with supplies. At Arakour, as German armor burned in the fields, American hospitals hummed with life. The battle was fought with fire, but it was won with endurance. And endurance was built not just on courage, but on the countless vials, bandages, and bottles that Japanese nurses could scarcely believe existed in such abundance. In that battle, as in so many others, the real miracle was not that Americans fought harder. It was that they bled, were saved, and returned again, an unbreakable cycle powered by medicine as relentless as any weapon. For the soldiers who lay on stretchers that September, staring at canvas ceilings while plasma dripped into their veins, the truth was clear. America's might was not only in its tanks, but in the certainty that no wound was final, no injury abandoned. That certainty echoed far louder than any shell. The real power of America's overflowing hospitals was not measured in crates of plasma or tons of sulfur, but in the minds and hearts of men. Strategy was written not only in maps and orders, but in morale, in the silent conviction of soldiers who believed survival was possible. War at its core is psychological, and nowhere was the divide between abundance and scarcity felt more sharply than in the trenches, foxholes and wards of the Second World War. For the Americans, the promise of medical care was an invisible shield. Every man stepping into battle carried with him the knowledge that, should steel tear flesh or fire consume him, hands would reach for him, supplies would be waiting, hospitals would open their doors. That knowledge transformed fear into endurance. It allowed soldiers to fight with ferocity, not blind to death, but confident that their nation had not abandoned them. This was not sentiment, it was doctrine. The US Army treated the wounded as assets, as men worth preserving, as soldiers who could return to the line or, at the very least, live to see home again. For the Japanese, the equation was merciless. Wounds often meant isolation, agony, and death. Their doctrine glorified sacrifice. Their logistics assumed it. Evacuation was rare, supplies meager, medicine fleeting. Soldiers knew it. Nurses knew it. Commanders knew it. The effect was corrosive. Men fought bravely, yes, but with a shadow of fatalism. To fall wounded was not to hope for salvation, but to face a lingering death in the mud. That despair whispered through units, weakening resolve in ways bullets could not. Captured Japanese nurses, confronted with the reality of American hospitals, felt the psychological weight firsthand. They saw wards buzzing with activity, supplies consumed without hesitation, lives saved with methodical ease. To them, it was like glimpsing a future their empire could never reach. They returned to their comrades with stories that sounded like legends, of sterile instruments, of endless bandages, of drugs that erased infection like magic. But those stories were true, and they struck at the heart of morale. For how could an army believe in victory when even its wounded were forsaken, while the enemies were resurrected in droves? Commanders noticed the shift. American generals wrote that their men fought with confidence, even after brutal losses, because the system of care restored hope. German and Japanese officers, by contrast, reported collapsing units when medical officers fell or supplies ran dry. The presence of hospitals or their absence rippled outward into strategy itself. Campaigns were shaped not only by terrain or weapons, but by whether an army could sustain its wounded. America could. Japan could not. Psychological warfare often conjures images of leaflets and propaganda broadcasts. But the overflowing American hospitals were propaganda in flesh and blood. Each soldier saved was a living message. You matter, you will survive, your sacrifice is not in vain. That message spread through divisions faster than any pamphlet. It forged loyalty, resilience, determination. Conversely, every Japanese soldier who died unattended, every nurse forced to improvise with scraps, carried a different message. You are alone. And that message eroded the spirit of even the fiercest warriors. The disparity influenced not only soldiers, but families at home. American mothers, wives, and children drew strength from the belief that their sons and husbands would be cared for. Letters from hospitals reassured them that wounds were not death sentences. Photographs of nurses tending to the wounded reinforced faith in the war effort. Japan offered no such comfort. Families often received silence, or the stark finality of death notices. The psychological gulf widened, shaping the very way societies endured the war. Strategically, this advantage reshaped campaigns. At Guadalcanal, American resilience stunned Japanese forces, who expected attrition to grind their enemy into retreat. Instead, wounded Americans returned to fight again while Japanese numbers dwindled irreversibly. At Saipan, American hospitals absorbed waves of casualties, allowing assaults to continue unbroken. Japanese defenders, bleeding without reprieve, collapsed under the weight of despair. In battle after battle, the ability to recycle strength while denying it to the enemy shifted momentum. For the Japanese nurses who witnessed this reality, the impact was devastating. They had been trained to honor sacrifice, to find nobility in hardship. Yet what they saw was not nobility but futility. They understood that no amount of spirit could compensate for empty shelves. Their disbelief at American abundance was not just astonishment, it was recognition of defeat. They grasped, perhaps earlier than some generals, that this was a war Japan could not win. Psychologically, the contrast was a war within the war. America's abundance fed courage, sustained hope, and prolonged endurance. Japan's scarcity bred fatalism, despair, and collapse. The battlefield was not only the ridges and beaches, but the space between a soldier's heartbeat and his fear. And in that battlefield, overflowing hospitals were as decisive as artillery barrages. By the end of the war, the lesson was unmistakable. An army that sustains its wounded sustains its spirit. An army that abandons its wounded abandons itself. America's overwhelming medical supply was more than logistics. It was strategy in its purest form, written not on maps but in the souls of its soldiers. The war ended not only with mushroom clouds and surrender documents, but with quiet echoes inside white canvas tents and hospital wards that had saved millions. The legacy of America's overflowing medical supplies lingered long after the guns fell silent. Japanese nurses who once could not believe their eyes had, in truth, glimpsed the future of warfare, a future where logistics, medicine, and preservation of life mattered as much as firepower. The conclusion was inescapable. America's victory was not built solely on tanks or bombers. It was cemented by the invisible lifelines of gauze, plasma, and penicillin. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel of Germany once admitted, "We built better tanks, but you built tanks that worked together." The same could be said of medicine. Japan fought with spirit, but America fought with systems. Those systems meant that a wounded private could expect care as surely as a general. No empire founded on scarcity could withstand that truth. The war's medical legacy reshaped the world. The mass production of penicillin transformed civilian medicine overnight, turning once lethal infections into treatable ailments. Plasma transfusion became standard across hospitals. Techniques developed in tents on Pacific islands, sterile procedure under fire, rapid evacuation, triage under chaos, became doctrine for peacetime emergency medicine. The lessons of war were transplanted into civilian life, saving countless lives long after the war itself. For the military, the lesson was even sharper. Cold War strategists recognized that logistics was the true battlefield. America's future wars would depend not only on missiles and tanks, but on the ability to project hospitals, medicines, and supplies anywhere in the world. In Korea, in Vietnam, in the Persian Gulf, the shadow of those World War II tents reappeared. Helicopter evacuations, MASH units, combat medics armed with morphine and plasma, all of it flowed directly from the innovations born out of necessity in the 1940s Japan. Too absorbed the lesson in silence. In the ruins of its empire, its surviving nurses and doctors carried bitter memories of scarcity. But in reconstruction, the nation embraced modernization of medicine. Hospitals rebuilt with American aid mirrored the very systems once disbelieved. Antibiotics, refrigeration, disposable equipment, these became the new standard. The disbelief of 1942 turned into the foundation of Japan's post-war medical miracle. The psychological lesson endured just as deeply. Soldiers remembered that their lives mattered, that their nation had not abandoned them. That bond between state and soldier, forged in overflowing hospitals, became a pillar of modern armies. The message was clear. No man should be left to die from preventable wounds. No army could fight long without caring for its own, and so the legacy stretched far beyond the Pacific Islands, where Japanese nurses first stared in awe. It lived on in every ambulance that raced through city streets, in every hospital stocked with antibiotics, in every military doctrine that placed logistics above glory. The war had revealed a universal truth. Victory belongs not only to those who fight hardest, but to those who preserve their fighters longest. As the century turned, that truth shaped conflicts in deserts and cities. In the Gulf War of 1991, American soldiers once again entered battle with overwhelming confidence, not just in their weapons, but in the medical machine that shadowed them. Mobile hospitals rose from sand like mirages, stocked with sterile abundance. Helicopters whisked the wounded into surgery within the fabled golden hour. It was Guadalcanal and Aracourt reborn, the same lesson applied in a new age. Japan's disbelief had become the world's doctrine. For history's witnesses, those Japanese nurses, the memory of overflowing American hospitals never faded. Their astonishment captured the essence of a war decided not only by firepower, but by the hidden power of logistics and care. They had seen with their own eyes the chasm between empires, one bleeding itself dry, the other replenishing its strength endlessly. It was not just abundance, it was inevitability. In the end, the legacy of those white tents is more than medical history. It is a reminder of what modern war truly is, a contest of systems, of supply lines, of the ability to preserve as well as destroy. Steel and fire may win battles, but it is endurance that wins wars. And endurance is built on more than courage. It is built on crates, on vials, on bandages, on the quiet hum of refrigerators in distant jungles. The Japanese nurses could not believe what they saw. But the world would come to believe and to learn. The war taught humanity that in modern conflict, connection outweighs isolation, abundance defeats scarcity, and survival itself becomes the ultimate weapon. In the silence after surrender, Among the ruins of Tokyo and the ashes of Hiroshima, the truth was undeniable. The overflowing American hospitals had not only healed the wounded, they had written the future of war.